Is Wisconsin in danger of becoming the next Nebraska? This is a question that I have seen pop up going back to Luke Fickell being hired. Is Wisconsin the type of program that is going to falter, going away from tradition? Well, let's look into this a little bit first before we can make that determination. And then if there is a problem, how can we fix it? So let's look at Nebraska. In 1998, at the end of the 97 season, Tom Osborne retires at Nebraska after spending 20 plus years as a head coach, winning 3 national championships, 12 conference championships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They built this program on a Nebraska way, so to speak. Their brand of football: power, option, triple option football, big country kids making way for these talented running backs and grinding the ball, having the black shirts and the strong walk-on program, all these kind of things that made Nebraska what it was going back forever, and then culminating in Tom Osborne winning 3 national championships in his last 4 years as head coach. In comes, after he retires, is his hand-picked successor, Frank Solich, who spent 19 years as an assistant coach at Nebraska. He was a Nebraska guy. And he's an unsung hero in their success because he was the one who coached up those great running backs who were part of that great system. But it was his time to take over at Nebraska. And there is a big problem when you take over for a legend, in that the only way that you can survive taking over for a legend is to beat the legend. To have your success be better than the legend that was behind you. That is a tough task when you're a place like Nebraska, especially when they had won 3 national championships in short succession right before Frank Solich took over. So he was already behind the 8 ball there. And they started out, I'd say, pretty okay. Transition year, 98. Went to a bowl game, lost. But then, 3 straight appearances in BCS Bowls, culminating in playing Miami in the Rose Bowl in the national championship game, which they lost. And that was the nail in the coffin for Frank Solich. Playing a rival in a major bowl game for the national championship and losing. And then the wheels came off, so to speak, where they regressed to a 7-7 record in 2002. 2003, they have a bit of a bounce back, finishing 9-3, but he's fired before the bowl game. He went 15-8-19 in 6 seasons at Nebraska. But when your program is used to winning national championships with this Nebraska way, with this style of football, and it doesn't work, automatically the fingers are pointed at the man in charge. When maybe they should have started looking at football in general and how college football was changing in the late 90s and going into the early 2000s. Frank Solich stuck to Nebraska tradition, and it slowly started to fail. Not because of him, but because the Nebraska way was starting to become the way of the past in college football, because college football was becoming a national sport. In comes the choice to change things at Nebraska. And they made a very, very drastic change from the power, I formation, option, triple option offense to the West Coast offense brought in by Bill Callahan, who before that had been the head coach of the Oakland Raiders. And not very successfully. He took John Gruden's players, went to the Super Bowl, and that was about it. They tanked shortly after that, and he was gone in 2 seasons. So Nebraska thinks, hey, let's hire him. Let's hire a guy who hadn't coached in college football since 1994. By the way, as Barry Alvarez's offensive line coach. Bill Callahan is a fantastic offensive line coach. He's one of the best ever. That's why he still has a job in the NFL as an offensive line coach. But nothing in his resume would make you think that he was head coach material, other than he had this old school mentality. The reason why Bill Callahan failed at Nebraska is they hired the wrong guy. They hired somebody, a career assistant, who had head coaching opportunities and failed. And thought that he was going to turn on a program that didn't need to be turned around, that basically had an off year and was living in a new age of college football, where, again, like I said before, many programs would say 9 wins a season, 10 wins is good enough, but not at Nebraska. So after 2 bowl games, 1 win, and 27 wins, Bill Callahan's out. Now, the problem that you have here is when you give him 4 years, he has a complete recruiting cycle, meaning his initial recruits are now seniors, redshirt juniors. They are the upperclassmen. So he goes in, the roster is completely changed, the roster's purged, however you want to say it. And now you set the stage for the guy that you probably should have hired back in 2004 when they hired Callahan in the first place. And that was the man who was the interim head coach for the bowl game, Bo Pelini, their defensive coordinator, who, again, is one of these guys that is a Nebraska guy. He had been there, and he had that mentality. He had that hard-nosed mentality that was Nebraska football back then. He wasn't a Nebraska player, came in, he was a defensive coordinator for 1 year, but he was the type of guy that could have led the program. And they waited 4 years. And then he took over. And in those 4 years, again, college football changed. Nebraska is now getting towards the end of their stay in the Big 12 and moving on to the Big 10, joining a national conference. A national conference that it was expanding. The conference that Nebraska made its fortune in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was the Big 8 Conference. This, I don't want to say smaller because there were some big-time programs. We got the Oklahoma schools. But this regional conference of the Oklahoma schools, the Kansas schools, Iowa State, Colorado, etc. And then towards the end of Tom Osborne's tenure, the Big 12 came into play. And then you took a conference and you added the Texas schools, Texas A&M, Texas Tech, Baylor, and you made the Big 12. Kept it in the region, but now you've added national powerhouses. More eyes on your program, more eyes on the conference, and your program becomes more national. That's where Frank Solich started to struggle, and he didn't struggle. College football was changing. And now, fast forward to 2011, and after 3 4-loss seasons, where Nebraska goes 9-4, 10-4, 10-4, now Nebraska enters the Big 10 Conference with Bo Pelini. And they succeed. He wins at minimum 9 games. Every year he's in the Big 10. The model of consistency. And this is where our first divergence from the idea that Wisconsin is becoming the new Nebraska is coming in. Before Frank Solich, Nebraska was in the business of winning national championships. When Frank Solich took over and college football was changing, they still, on average, would win 9-10 games. Nebraska was still a national program. Bo Pelini comes in. They go back to winning 9-10 games a year. Again, he didn't win less than 9 games in his time at Nebraska. The difference being, there were still people involved who thought they should still be winning national championships. And that's not what happened. Wisconsin, on the other hand, this is a different animal that you have to look at. Where Nebraska was not happy with 9-10 wins and having embarrassing losses in conference, something they never had before. Now we have the Paul Chryst era at Wisconsin. Let's look at how Wisconsin's football program has changed during Paul Chryst's years. People are saying we're not satisfied with winning 8, 9, 10 games. But that's not the problem. The win-loss record at Wisconsin was not the problem with Paul Chryst. It was the downturn in recruiting, the inability to set up a recruiting department, and the slow downturn that happened at Wisconsin post the 2017 season. 2017, we go 13-1. We beat Miami in the Orange Bowl. 2018, 8-5. But we win the Pinstripe Bowl against Miami. 2019, we go to the Rose Bowl. We lose to Oregon. 2020, we go to the Duke's Mayo Bowl. We'll go 4-3. 2021, we go 9-4 and go to the Las Vegas Bowl. And then it bottomed out in 2022, going 7-6 overall. The trend was going downwards. This is where the comparisons to Nebraska don't fit in, because the downfall was there. The downturn was there because of problems with the program. The players were still there, but I also don't really see the comparison with Nebraska, because we weren't winning national championships. Nebraska wasn't satisfied winning 9 games, because they were used to winning national championships. Wisconsin is not satisfied with winning 8-9 games, because that was the perceived ceiling. 9 wins and going to a mid-major bowl game was good enough. Anything else was golden. And we should be happy that we got that far, because we are Wisconsin. That is the mentality that got Paul Chryst fired. Not to say that he didn't want the program to do better. It's not that. It's that general malaise and the general acceptance that we're not going to rise above our station anymore is what made it easy to make the decision to move on. And part of the reason why the fans resent Luke Fickell now, because he came out and said that he wanted to win national championships. Well, he should be. He should want to. That's the whole point. He hasn't, and it might take him a while. Hell, it might never happen. But that's not why we're in this situation we are now. Now we can get into that. The next thing that we can look into about this is the people talking about the massive shift in the offensive focus from Paul Chryst to Phil Longo, and the massive shift from Frank Solich to Bill Callahan as a comparable for how Wisconsin is becoming the next Nebraska. Now, this one is an easy one to debunk, because the transition between what Frank Solich was doing to what Bill Callahan was doing is literally night and day. As much as you want to say that Phil Longo's offense goes away from Wisconsin tradition, nothing that they're doing now hasn't been done at Wisconsin before. Some of the passing concepts are similar. Some of the run schemes are very similar. They're just done out of different formations and they want to use different types of players. And they put the recruiting focus in different places at a different tempo. But there's still a mix between run and pass. They're very similar passing concepts. Wisconsin has run mesh. Wisconsin has run stick. Lots of things. Hell, 3rd and 7, Paul Chryst is going to run stick nod with a tight end. Okay? You see that still now. So we want to say that the transition from the pro style early 2000s offense of Paul Chryst to the air raid is this big massive jump If this was 2003 and we were transitioning from the Paul Chryst offense to the Mike Leach air raid, yes, that would be a drastic change to throwing the ball 70 times a game. But that's not what's happened. And that's not what's going to happen. What Wisconsin did this year more than anything with Phil Longo was a step towards modernizing the offense. Not completely changing it, modernizing it. And I got news for everybody out there. If Phil Longo leaves tomorrow, a modern spread offense will take its place. Because I can think of one offensive coordinator out there still who runs the early 2000s to mid 2000s power pro offense. And that's Brian Ferentz. Do you want Brian Ferentz taking over? I didn't think so. But we need to get in position to get with the times. And I think Luke Fickell and his staff is going to become the sacrificial lambs of that transition. Something that needed to happen. Comparing this to Nebraska, Nebraska's transition was not something that needed to happen. And that transition didn't need to happen so severely. If it was all about modernizing the offense, they would have asked Frank Solich to hire a new quarterbacks coach, maybe a new offensive coordinator, and start transitioning away from what they were doing, but building off of the Nebraska way. That's what Phil Longo has been doing. We've been running the ball a lot, and the offense, the focus has been on the run game still. Throwing the ball a lot, but that doesn't change anything. Nebraska took a dive off a cliff and belly flopped. Wisconsin took a dive off the medium springboard and fell flat. But the great thing about current modern college football as comparison to college football back in the early 2000s is, and this is a benefit that we have, is that the roster can be rebuilt quickly. Luke Fickell and his staff gave every player the same challenge when they met in the offseason. If they didn't think they could handle this type of football, they would have been gone. But they were given the opportunity to show that they belonged. He could have wiped out the roster. But he wanted to preserve tradition. He wanted to preserve the players. It's not the players' fault that there was a coaching change. Maybe a little bit. But he felt that he owed it to the returning players to give them a chance. Well, that faith was rewarded by the play that we have seen this season. And after the comments made by Hunter Wohler and also Tanner Mordecai, there are players on the roster currently who are going through the motions, who never bought into the program out of spite, out of love for the previous coaches, whatever. But again, it's not the current coach's fault that there was a coaching change. So if you're pissed off, take it out on Chris McIntosh. Go sit with him. Go talk with him. I'm sure those meetings happen. But this selfish ball that it sounds like a lot of players are playing is a big reason for the problems that we are having currently. And it's something that's going to have to be remedied fast. We're going to see a lot of players start to sit out for quote-unquote NFL prep and to prepare for transfers. I think the football team's going to play better because of it. But in conclusion, is Wisconsin the next Nebraska? No. Because you can't compare this Wisconsin to the first Nebraska. Wisconsin could become the next Nebraska if in 3 years they panic, or 2 years they panic and try to course correct instead of seeing the program through. Insist on change, insist on growth, but the decision was made. Where Nebraska fell down was their expectations were in the wrong place because they didn't see how college football was changing. And they made a drastic change in how they did football. On the outside, this may look like a drastic change for Wisconsin, but what it is a step towards modern college football. This is the step that Nebraska should have taken back in 2003 instead of jumping off the cliff. And at the end of the day, it was a step that was necessary. And the program will be better for it. Maybe not right now. Maybe not in the short-term future. But I strongly believe we're going to get there.
I'm going to talk about the people involved. We talked about in the first video about the coaches, and some of them anyways, but we didn't talk as much comparables between the two programs and who is each other's blank. Okay, that might not make any sense the way I'm saying it there, but we're going to give it a shot here. And we're going to go through the two scenarios and talk about who is a comparable candidate for each program, comparing the coaches, and then who would maybe be the better choice. All right, so let's go with the obvious comparables to set the standard. So if we're going to use Nebraska as the baseline, we're going to start with Tom Osborne, legendary coach, the father of the modern program. I mean, Nebraska goes back, way back to the Delaney days and the Dana Bible days and people like that. But in terms of the discussion we're having now, Tom Osborne is the number one. And obviously, the one and only comparable with Wisconsin is Barry Alvarez. I don't think there's any discussion about that. I think that is the clear, obvious, and only choice in that category. So let's go to number two. Who is the Frank Solich of this situation? Frank Solich, longtime assistant, Nebraska guy, and they're at the cusp of when modern football started to take over. And obviously, the clear-cut comparison between Nebraska and Wisconsin with Frank Solich is Paul Chryst. I mean, is there anybody else? Wisconsin guy, carrying on the tradition, was there when tradition caught up with the program. So there we are. And I think right there, that's where the comparables end. And it's just going to really show you how the situations between the two schools are very, very different. So let's start with Bill Callahan. Bill Callahan was the out of left field hire that started really this whole downward spiral. I mean, the firing of Frank Solich was the start of this change of their program. And Bill Callahan was the guy who came in and tried to flip things on its end. Now, Wisconsin fans will say that Phil Longo is Wisconsin's Bill Callahan. But I disagree. If you really look at it, Phil Longo is way more... He isn't true air raid. He uses elements of air raid in a modern spread offense. So if you want a guy coming in with Bill Callahan level of experience as a head coach, esteem as a position coach and a coordinator coming in to radically change things, then Wisconsin would have hired Cliff Kingsbury. Cliff Kingsbury would be the radical departure from the norm and the radical change from how things have always been done at Wisconsin football. The big difference between Phil Longo and what Wisconsin is doing, other than the fact is everything on a shotgun, is the tempo. But so many of the plays that Phil Longo uses, Wisconsin has used for years in slightly different ways and under center and yada, 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 but it's basically the same stuff. Or I don't want to say basically the same stuff. That's completely wrong. Similar enough, which is why I thought Phil Longo's offense would work at Wisconsin to begin with. But taking a Mike Leach disciple and completely upending to the more traditional air raid of the wide splits and the throwing the ball to 60, 70 times a game and replacing every aspect of the run game with a pass game. That's not Phil Longo. That's Cliff Kingsbury. And that's the mistake that was made. Okay, so we're through Bill Callahan. Now we're on to Bo Pelini. Bo Pelini, the right guy at the time, the right guy with the right mentality, but also a bit of an unknown. How is a first-time head coach going to lead a legendary program? You don't know. You got the consistency that I think people should be able to expect from a guy like that, or hope, but didn't get into the next level. You could say that's Jim Leonard, and that's probably the closest comparison in this situation. And what the problem is they grew to resent it. And that's something I don't think we want to have happen with Jim Leonard. Jim Leonard came out and was averaging 8 wins a year. Would he still love him the same way we do? Don't know. But Bo Pelini, Luke Fickell is not our Bo Pelini. So that brings us to the next man in the transition, and one I had forgotten about in my previous breakdown when we were thinking more philosophically. Who would be Wisconsin's Scott Frost? Okay, so when we're thinking Scott Frost, we're thinking Nebraska guy in name only. He played there, but nothing he's doing has anything to do with old school Nebraska football. He took a new school approach and was a short-term mid-major success, okay, with a claimed national championship. So who's a Wisconsin guy with short-term mid-major success, and I'll use success loosely, that was elevated based on short-term results without seeing long-term results because there wasn't enough data to prove that? Well, you could say Sean Lewis. In a couple years, you could say John Budmeyer. But there really isn't anybody in the Wisconsin pipeline that compares to Scott Frost. And that's what got us to where we are. So before we go on and talk about some of the Nebraska comparables to some of the Wisconsin hires and how their program could have changed if they got some different guys in the meantime, it is too simplistic of an answer to say that Nebraska's program fell apart because in 2003 they decided to switch from the I-bone offense to the West Coast. I think it was a series of knee-jerk reactions and not adjusting your expectations to meet a modern world that put Nebraska in the situation they were. It's too simplistic to say that their program completely changed on one hire. So now let's get to Wisconsin. Who could have been Nebraska's Luke Fickell? Who could have been a guy back in 2003 who had mid-major success, program building, and turning a very much a lesser-known program into one that was known nationally, with a defensive background that could have served as both an innovator and a stabilizer when Nebraska would have needed it the most? and who would have surrounded himself with good people who would know how to transition from one style to the other. Back in 2003, instead of hiring Bill Callahan, Nebraska should have hired Gary Patterson from TCU. Remember where TCU was before Gary Patterson, for LaDainian Tomlinson, and how quickly that program rose from below mid-major to now, under Sonny Dykes, a national program in the Big 12. I don't even think they were in the Conference USA when Gary Patterson got there. I could be wrong. But Gary Patterson, instead of hiring Bill Callahan, you want your Luke Fickell of 2003, that would have been Bill Callahan. Or excuse me, that would have been Gary Patterson. No doubt. Imagine what Gary Patterson did with TCU, doing it in Nebraska in the mid-2000s. Turning from the eye bone to the offense that got LaDainian Tomlinson the pick where he was in the draft, number 5 overall. So while I can see the want to compare Wisconsin to Nebraska, the people are different. The situation is different. More importantly, the Wisconsin situation is far too fresh to make any kind of absolute declaration of what Wisconsin will be. I hope that Wisconsin has their Gary Patterson, but we'll have to see. All right, so there's a little bit of a look at the people involved in the Wisconsin becoming the next Nebraska debate. Coming your way in the next couple days will be the Wisconsin Northwestern breakdown, and we'll really break down what some are calling the worst defeat in 25 years. We'll see you then.